The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Anwar Ibrahim, Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance of Malaysia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Anwar Ibrahim, Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Malaysia. I invite him to address the Assembly. Dipersilakan Yang Amat Berhormat.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam Malaysia Madani. Izinkan saya bagi pihak negara dan rakyat Malaysia mengemukakan pandangan ke arah keamanan dan kesejahteraan sempena Perhimpunan Agung PBB New York September 2023. Mr. President, when this August Assembly was established almost 80 years ago, the world was still reeling from the horrors of a catastrophic bloodletting that our nation's resolved should never be repeated. A decision profound in wisdom, magnanimous in intent, and bold in ambition was made so that the General Assembly would become the main deliberative, policy-making, and representative organ of the United Nations. A decision that manifested no less than the very strength and courage of our convictions. By giving equal voice to the sovereign nations of the world, the founders of the United Nations pursued a vision of a more democratic world predicated on the dictates of equity and justice. This was a vision that consigned to the past the predations of the strong of the weak, the strong over the weak, of the rich and powerful over the poor and the marginalized, and of the big powers over the rest. That vision, in my opinion, has been utterly shattered to pieces. Today, we find that the major powers and those that aspire to greater international status are increasingly casting the United Nations aside for smaller, supposedly more efficacious platforms. As the powers that be continue to pay lip service to the imperative of multilateralism, we see the emergence of minilateralism instead, effectively becoming fragmented configurations of power. Mr. President, we are living in a deeply polarized world. We are seeing major power rivalry unfolding with consequences that would negatively impact nations, especially the smaller ones in the regions of conflict. The upshot is that we are confronted with a geopolitical and geostrategic dilemma. While the major powers continue to assure that a binary choice is not being imposed, the reality for many is that it is the only choice offered. Unchecked, this will ultimately lead once again to a world where the masses are unrepresented, where the few rule over the many, and the many resent the few. The lofty ideals and principles enshrined in the UN Charter call upon nations to resolve their disputes through peaceful means and refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state. We condemned unequivocally the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This conflict in Ukraine, for example, underscores the imperative to make peace and settle differences amicably through negotiations. Nevertheless, time is not on our side. And owing to the protracted failure to deal with this Russian-Ukraine crisis, I urge for a concerted multilateral effort led by the United Nations to resolve this. We cannot choose our neighbors, but we can choose to live in peace with them. And peace cannot happen without the cessation of hostilities by all parties. It is imperative for all parties to return to dialogue and resolve their differences through the negotiation table. The extent of the Ukraine conflict has radiated throughout the world as food prices have skyrocketed, leading to shortages and hunger, further malnutrition and despair. As in other conflicts elsewhere, be it in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, forced migration take place, piling on the problems of refugees and statelessness. Mr. President, in the Middle East, the politics of dispossession continues with a vengeance, with more illegal settlements being built, stripping Palestinians of land that rightly belongs to them. This constitutes a gross violation of international law. It also poses an insurmountable obstacle to a two-state solution, not to mention the continued killings. There is also flagrant hypocrisy in dealing with the issue of Palestine. The international community must speak up against the atrocities committed towards the Palestinians, even as they so vehemently speak out against human rights violations, injustice, and abusive regimes. On Afghanistan, Malaysia remains deeply concerned with the dire humanitarian situation in the country. This is especially so given that the country is grappling with its third consecutive year of drought and devastating locust infestation that severely undermined wheat harvests. On our part, Malaysia is committed to continue its existing people-to-people relations with Afghanistan, including through the provision of humanitarian aid. However, we remain resolute and firm in our call on the authority of Afghanistan to reverse their exclusionary and discriminatory policies against women and girls.